Hi everyone, Susan Corbett, Custom Machine Quilting. In this video, the bulk of what I'll be showing you is freehand flowers and feathers. Those predominate over the middle section of this quilt, so that's where we'll put most of our focus today. The printed panel in the middle was our springboard for the inspiration for the quilting here. I'm working on this big bed quilt for Judy O'Connell. So what I've done so far is, of course, stabilize the outer edge, and then I ditch quilted in between these two borders. This border gets a whole bunch of feathers. And this one I've started outlining the print. And this is one piece of fabric. This, and this. This, and this is all one piece of fabric. So I've quilted on the outside of this line and outside here to make it look like that's a pieced frame. I've not yet decided what to do in this border. Up here I'm doing what's called a finger feather. It's a good feather for these narrow borders, and I've chosen a feather for this border because it's a busy print and not much else is going to show, and it'll be really pretty. I think it's a great parallel to have feathers in the outer border and then have them again someplace else. You get a cohesive design scheme that way. So in this, well, I chose to treat all this as one piece, and I'm crosshatching. I don't know if I'm going to keep that increment or go with something smaller. I figured I'd get all the rest of it quilted and then see how I feel about it. One of the reasons I decided to crosshatch it is so I wouldn't have to think up something to do in each one of those big squares. And if I did, that would mean a whole bunch of stops and starts, and I didn't want to do that. This is simpler. I think some straight lines are called for here, and that came together pretty quickly. So then there's that huge medallion. I've outlined the print in the middle, and I've decided to treat these two borders and the background as all one piece because the colors are so very similar. And so what I have planned for that is Judy picked out a flower. I think she wants this flower to duplicate here in this area. And of course I'll use matching thread. I'm using one thread color for the whole quilt, which I don't ordinarily do, but in this case that's totally appropriate. I could have gone with something darker in some places, but she wanted to go with all one. So I quilted the feathers on that bottom border, and I outlined the print in the next border. I'm doing a wavy line in our pretend frame. And then there are the finger feathers. That's how that's going. For some of this, I think, I don't know. I'm going to see if I can get away with not turning the quilt. Although, depending on what happens in that border, I may have to anyway. Now these flowers are going to be kind of large, so I've opted to make the centers a little bit more creative than I normally would. Usually it's just a circle, but I'm doing a lot of little bitty circles. And then I'm adding some pretty loose leaves, not leaves, petals in here. I've cranked the speed up a little bit, and I'm holding the handles loosely and letting the machine kind of float. I find that the more irregular the petals are, the better they look. A death grip would not be my friend here. And I'm adding some more petals, some partials around that first layer, so it looks like there's different layers of them, some big, some little. Like that flower has really opened up and they're lush. They turned out to not look exactly like the flowers in the fabric, but I don't think that matters at all. I think it's pretty good looking. So there I'm adding a leaf, backtracking a little bit to make it look like it's tightly packed in there, and then adding some veins. So I'm stopping that flower where it is and moving on to adding another. I aimed to do like 3 big flowers and then switch over and add some other smaller flowers. Now I'm doing one of the other flowers. So I've done one circle in the middle, and I'm making some wider, kind of ruffly petals. And then I'm going back in as long as I'm in there and adding some little creases, just one or two in each petal. If you add a whole bunch, then it just squashes the whole flower and it doesn't look near as good. And then I just moved on to doing one more. This flower might look like it's a whole new one, but really it's just like a side view of it. In some parts of the print, it looks like the flower is drooping over, so you just see a part of it. And I thought that would give us some really good contrast, and just being like half a flower, it could fill up some strange holes in a way where there wouldn't be enough to do a whole great big one. So that was useful. And now it's a matter of filling in the rest of the space with some leaves and some background quilting. But before I get to all that stuff, I had to think about where those feathers were going to go. And I'm making it up as I go along, as usual. So these things need thinking about. the background is going to be a little tiny leaf meander with some loop meander thrown in for the little tiny spaces. I didn't want to do a really super intricate background because we're not going all out with the quilting on this quilt. It's custom, but not ultra. So as long as I'm in there, I may as well fill in those spaces in between the flowers. Here is where it all starts to come together. This is, I believe, the top of the quilt. So this area is between two corners of flowers. And I decided to add 2 feather sprays emanating from the center medallion. So I've freehanded part of a stem, and now there's the other part, and I'm going to start adding feathers. They can be wider where there's room, and then the closer we get to the top of the stem, I'll start to make them smaller. And now I'll stop and reduce speed and decorate that stem. It's just a bunch of little tiny arcs. I decided to do that in these feathers, but not the ones in the outer border, because this is the middle, and that's where I'm focusing most of the attention. It's freehand. I don't worry about perfectly parallel lines, and as a freehander, I'm kind of averse to perfect symmetry. I don't think all 4 corners need to be exactly alike. I think it's more interesting if they're all different. So now I'm adding the outer feathers, and since there's more room there, I tend to put bigger ones and more of them. And after those are in, then I'll think about where to add another, where to put little sprigs of new growth with little bitty feathers and leaves. And then ultimately, all this will get echoed before moving on to filling up all the remaining spaces with more leaves and little flowers and background quilting. Here is a look at adding some feathers in this narrow border. I've done this so often that this is second nature, and so it's a border I can knock out pretty darn quickly. So I bought this book a long time ago. It is an AQS book published in '96. So I don't know how easy or hard it is to find, but I bet there's copies out there somewhere. It's wonderful because the author explains what's going on in a given design and where to use it. It's really good. This is a hand quilting book, but before you can quilt on any machine or by hand or whatever, you have to know how to quilt, like what to quilt and where things are appropriate and how big and that kind of thing. So in this book, she says the feathers need to change directions, but they don't have to. That's one option. And the point of it is that you put in that stem first, and it curves deeply from one end of the border to the other, from one side to the other, and then you fill in with those feathers. Now, when I learned to quilt, I learned from Linda Taylor, and when I got this book and took this class, that opened up a whole new world of feathers for me. So you can still get this, and I highly recommend it. And so one of the options she has in here is this page, where you can just throw in all kinds of things you want. And I love to do that because, it's great to throw in a flourish, a leaf, some kind of tendril, or here in this case she has flowers. And with this narrow a border, I don't feel like I have to put in a two-sided stem. Just a single line will suffice. So that's an option. So I'm making these deep curves. They're not precise, it's freehand. I'm starting the feather from the bottom and going up. And at the end of each well, I'm kind of doing two sides at the same time, you know, alternating back and forth for efficiency's sake. Now I can come all the way to the end, or I can hold off a little bit. And in the space that's empty, I can put in a tendril or something if I want to. Or I can make the next feather wrap all the way around. And now here's a look at outlining some of the border print. Once again, or as usual, I'm not quilting every little detail. I'm hitting the high points and striving for even quilting throughout. In some cases, I would love to quilt the background, but in this case, we're not going to. My client did ask me to quilt in the date, which I forgot to do, and so at the end of the whole process, I thought, well, there's some white space left over in there, so I picked out one of those spaces and quilted a 20 to 23 in there. At this point, I have quilted 3 sides of the outer border, and I am going to take the quilt off and turn it and repin it in order to quilt that narrow border. But at this point, I got out of quilting these feathers on the outer border without turning it. I just did them piece by piece. So this is the last row. So I freehanded a curvy stem, and then I'm putting in feathers and adding tendrils and things, leaves and such. Where there's one well that was really deep, I added a string of little feathers in the opposite direction. With feathers, really, the possibilities are limitless. That was quick and pretty satisfying. Having finished, here is a look at the back of the quilt, where you can see all sorts of good detail in there. I decided to leave the crosshatching the size it was. The client was very happy with it. I still am not quite sure that was the right decision. It's just a little big for my tastes. And I did opt for a cable in that narrow border. There's a reason I'm a freehander and not a line follower. I'm not real happy with the way it turned out, but I think it's passable, and the client really liked it a lot. To quilt in that cable, I was going to laser it in, so I made myself a paper pattern which didn't exactly fit. So to make it fit, I used the instructions from this excellent book. I cut apart the little segments and taped them down to a piece of paper that was the right length. I drew in my corner and just drifted from one point to another to fill in the gaps, and so the finished product does not look like there are any gaps in there, and the differences in those increments are indiscernible here in the final event. I'm loving all the dimension that we got here, and part of that is due to using one layer of Hobbs wool batting. It's lofty, and this quilt is super drapey and soft. And we just love the way it turned out. Hope that was helpful.